The millionaire CEO bends down to comfort a sobbing toddler on the crowded train, unaware that destiny is about to strike. As the little one lifts his tear-stained face, the CEO feels thunder in his chest. The child's features are a perfect reflection of his own. The truth hangs in the air like a shadow ready to pounce. Could this crying stranger be his son? Alexander Sterling had conquered Wall Street, but when tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb and whispered, "Papa?" he realized he'd been bankrupt in all the ways that truly mattered. The luxury train car felt like a mobile prison. Alexander Sterling sat rigid in Italian leather, steel-gray eyes fixed on quarterly reports that blurred together like numbers in a fever dream. At 42, he commanded an $8 billion empire, but wealth had become both crown and tage. His phone buzzed: Tokyo markets, London mergers, Dubai contracts. Each notification felt like another chain around his chest. Success was a hungry god that devoured everything and still demanded more. Alexander's reflection stared back from the darkened window, sharp jawline, expensive haircut, eyes that had forgotten softness. The magazine covers called him the man who never loses, but behind the facade, something essential had withered away. A memory flickered, a woman's laugh, warm and genuine from 3 years ago when he'd still believed he might be capable of something beyond profit margins. Isabella. Her name sent an uncomfortable pang through his chest, quickly suppressed. She'd been different, seeing past his wealth to something he thought was lost forever, until he'd proven her wrong in the cruelest way possible. Numbers were safer than feelings. Spreadsheets didn't betray you or demand more than you could give. 6 cars away in economy class, Isabella Martinez cradled her sleeping son, her back aching from the uncomfortable position. At 28, she looked older, worn thin by sleepless nights and single motherhood's relentless responsibility. But gazing at 2-year-old Miguel, her dark eyes glowed with fierce love that could have powered the train. The boy was beautiful, thick dark hair curling at the edges, long lashes casting shadows on olive cheeks, a stubborn chin that jetted out when determined. He looked so much like his father it sometimes stole Isabella's breath, a daily reminder of choices made and hearts broken. Her purse held everything precious: train tickets bought with her last paycheck, a job offer from a Seattle hospital, and hope wrapped in determination. She'd finally saved enough to escape poverty, to give Miguel chances she'd never had. "We're going somewhere better, mi amor," she whispered against his hair. "Somewhere we can start over." These words were her prayer, repeated every night while working double shifts, every morning walking him to the neighbors before catching the bus to her second job. Everything was for Miguel, the son who'd given her purpose when she thought her life was over. Isabella's fingers traced the silver locket at her throat, holding Miguel's first birthday photo. She'd bought it with that week's tips, wanting something beautiful for the memory of pure joy. She never spoke of Miguel's father. The pain remained too raw, the betrayal too complete. Alexander Sterling. Even his name felt like poison. 3 years ago, she'd believed what they shared was real, that his tender touch meant something beyond desire. The pregnancy test changed everything. The man who'd whispered poetry suddenly looked at her like she was a problem to solve. The check he'd offered, enough to take care of things, felt like a slap. When she'd refused, security escorted her from his building like a criminal. She'd never told him she'd kept the baby, never told him about nights crying herself to sleep, wondering how someone could love so completely, then discard that love like yesterday's newspaper. Have you ever had to start over completely? What gave you the strength to rebuild your life? Share your story of resilience in the comments. Miguel stirred, his little fist pressing against her chest. Even sleeping, he sensed her tension. He'd always been perceptive, as if feeling emotions in the air around him. The train rounded a curve, and Miguel's eyes fluttered open. For a heartbeat, he stared up with that serious expression that always tightened Isabella's chest with love. Then his face crumpled, and the sound that emerged could have shattered crystal. "Shh, baby, what's wrong?" Isabella tried comforting him, but Miguel was inconsolable. His cries echoed through the economy car, drawing irritated glances from passengers. A businesswoman shot Isabella a look that could curdle milk. Isabella fumbled through her backpack for Miguel's favorite toy, a stuffed lion with one missing eye, but he pushed it away. His wails grew louder, more desperate, and familiar panic fluttered in Isabella's throat. "Please, Miguel, Mama's here," she whispered, but her voice cracked with exhaustion. She'd been traveling 12 hours on gas station coffee and adrenaline. Hostile stares felt like physical blows, confirming her worst fears about her mothering abilities. Miguel's cries reached a crescendo that seemed to vibrate through the train itself. Isabella stood, swaying with the motion, trying to rock him, but nothing worked. Passengers scowled openly, someone muttering about inconsiderate people, and Isabella felt tears burning. That's when she saw movement, a tall figure rising from several rows up, moving towards them with purpose rather than annoyance. Something about his confident yet careful gait made Isabella's pulse quicken with inexplicable recognition. The man approached slowly, attention focused entirely on Miguel with intensity that made Isabella's breath catch. When their eyes met, she saw genuine concern mixed with something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition. "May I?" he asked softly, his voice carrying reverence that seemed strange from a stranger. Isabella hesitated, every maternal instinct screaming protection, but Miguel's cries were breaking her heart, and something in the stranger's eyes, a depth that went beyond sympathy, made her nod despite reservations. The moment the man's hands touched Miguel, magic happened. The crying stopped instantly, as if someone had cast a spell. Miguel looked up with wide, curious eyes, then reached up with fearless trust and wrapped tiny fingers around his thumb. "Hello, little one," he whispered, and Isabella's world exploded. She knew that voice. She'd heard it whisper poetry in darkness, laugh at her terrible jokes, tell her she was beautiful in ways that made her believe it. She'd also heard it dismiss her with cold precision when she'd needed him most. The man holding her son was Alexander Sterling, Miguel's father, the man who'd offered money to make his child disappear. The man now staring at his son with wonder and dawning recognition that would change 3 lives forever. "Isabella?" Alexander's voice was barely a whisper, his face pale as understanding crashed over him. "This is your son, Isabella managed, voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "This is Miguel." And as father and son looked at each other for the first time, Isabella saw something she'd never expected in Alexander Sterling's eyes. Tears. The world tilted sideways as Alexander stared into eyes that were unmistakably his own, steel-gray irises gazing up from a face so innocent it made his chest physically ache. Miguel's tiny hand gripped his thumb with surprising strength, as if afraid to let go. "Miguel," Alexander whispered, testing the name like a forgotten prayer. The sound unlocked something buried deep in his chest, something he'd convinced himself no longer existed. "My God, Isabella, he's beautiful!" Isabella's laugh came out broken, sharp with years of suppressed pain. Don't you dare act like you care when you offered me money to—" Her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together, fighting for control. But Alexander couldn't look away from his son. Miguel had settled completely in his arms, one small hand pressed against Alexander's chest as if feeling for his heartbeat. The child's trust was absolute, devastating in its purity. "How old is he?" Alexander's voice was rough, barely recognizable. 26 months, Isabella replied carefully. "He'll be 2 in December." December, 9 months after their last night together, when Isabella had looked at him like he hung the stars, and he'd believed for precious hours that he might be worthy of her faith. I started to speak, but Miguel pressed his face against Alexander's neck, warm breath tickling his skin. The gesture was so trusting that whatever words Alexander had planned died in his throat. "Papa?" Miguel's voice was barely a whisper, muffled against Alexander's shoulder, but it hit him with the force of an avalanche. Alexander's knees almost buckled. His arms tightened instinctively around his son, as if he could make up for 2 years of absence with the strength of his embrace. "He called me." "He calls every man papa," Isabella said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "He doesn't know." The lie was transparent. Even at not quite 2, Miguel recognized something, an invisible thread connecting him to this stranger. The way he stopped crying instantly, how he now clung like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. Alexander looked up at Isabella, really seeing her for the first time since recognition struck. She was thinner than he remembered, her face carrying exhaustion lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Her clothes were clean but worn, shoes scuffed from walking rather than riding in limousines. The contrast to his custom suit was stark, shameful. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question escaped before he could stop it. "Tell you?" Her voice rose enough to make passengers glance their way. She lowered it again, fury remaining. "After you offered me money to get rid of him? After security threw me out like a criminal? When exactly should I have called?" Each word hit precisely, aimed at guilt he'd carried like shrapnel in his chest. Alexander remembered that day with crystal clarity. The panic when Isabella whispered "pregnant," his carefully constructed world crumbling. He'd reacted like a coward, throwing money at a problem instead of facing it. "I was scared," he said quietly, the admission feeling like glass in his throat. "My father destroyed every relationship because business came first. I thought I'd do the same to you, to him." Isabella's expression flickered, and for a moment Alexander saw past her armor to the young woman who had once looked at him like he could move mountains. But the moment passed, replaced by the harder version his cruelty had forged. "So you abandoned us before you could hurt us. How noble!" "Isabella, please!" "No!" She stepped closer, eyes blazing with 26 months of fury. "You don't get to please me. You don't get to hold him and suddenly decide you want to be a father. You don't get to walk back into our lives because fate forced your hand." But even as she spoke, Alexander saw how her eyes lingered on Miguel's peaceful face, how her expression softened watching their son sleep so contentedly in his arms. Whatever anger she felt toward Alexander, her love for Miguel was absolute, including wanting what was best for him. "He looks like you," Alexander said softly, his free hand hovering near Miguel's dark curls before dropping. "But he has your smile. I remember your smile." The simple words carried the weight of everything he'd lost, everything he'd thrown away in cowardice. Isabella's breath caught, and momentarily the anger was replaced by something more vulnerable, more dangerous. Don't do this to me again." "Do what?" "Make me hope. I can't survive it again." Alexander felt something crack open in his chest, something sealed shut so long he'd forgotten it existed. Looking at Isabella, really seeing her, not as the complication she had represented, but as the woman who had carried and raised his child alone, the full weight of his failures crashed down. "I'm sorry," he said, words feeling inadequate compared to the magnitude of what he'd done. "God, Isabella, I'm so sorry. I was a coward and you and Miguel paid the price." Miguel stirred, making a small sound that went straight to Alexander's heart. "His son! He had a son. The reality was reshaping him from the inside out with every breath the child took. "Sorry doesn't pay rent," Isabella said, but her voice had lost some edge. "Sorry doesn't wake up at 3 a.m. with nightmares. Sorry doesn't explain to a little boy why other children have daddies." Each word was perfectly placed to cause maximum damage. Alexander deserved every cut. But holding Miguel, feeling his steady breathing, he realized sorry wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to make up for what he'd stolen from his son, from Isabella, from himself. "Let me try," he said suddenly, surprising himself as much as Isabella. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I have no right to ask, but he's my son, Isabella, our son, and I want to know him. I want to be part of his life if you'll let me." The silence stretched, filled only by train wheels and Miguel's soft breathing. Other passengers moved around them, but Alexander felt suspended in a bubble, just the three of them and the weight of a decision that would change everything. Isabella's eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the calculation, the coldness she expected, but Alexander let her see everything: the regret, the wonder, the desperate longing of a man who just discovered what he'd been missing his entire life. "He doesn't even know you," she said finally, her voice smaller now, uncertain. "Then let me get to know him. Let him get to know me." Miguel chose that moment to open his eyes, blinking up at Alexander with that serious expression that was apparently genetic. Then, to Alexander's amazement, his son smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up his entire face and made Alexander's heart forget how to beat. "Papa," Miguel said again, clearly, deliberately, and Alexander felt his carefully constructed world shatter completely, leaving something raw and real and infinitely more precious in its place. Isabella saw it happen, the exact moment when Alexander Sterling, billionaire CEO, fell completely and irrevocably in love with his son. Despite everything, despite the hurt and anger and years of struggle, she felt something shift inside her own carefully guarded heart. The train swayed around another curve and Alexander instinctively adjusted his hold on Miguel, movements natural as if he'd been holding this child his entire life. The gesture was small, unconscious, but spoke to something Isabella had never expected to see, the birth of a father's protective instinct. "I don't know how to trust you again," she admitted quietly, words torn from somewhere deep inside. "I don't know how to be a father," Alexander replied with devastating honesty. "But I want to learn. I need to learn." And in that moment, with their son sleeping peacefully between them, Isabella wondered if perhaps some bridges weren't as burned as she'd believed. Perhaps some chances were worth taking, even when your heart was terrified of the fall. The spell was broken by Miguel's sudden squirm, followed by a whimper that made both adults tense. Isabella immediately stepped forward, maternal instincts overriding everything else. "He needs changing," she said briskly, the practical need giving her an excuse to retreat from the emotional minefield. Alexander hesitated before gently transferring Miguel back to Isabella's arms. The loss of his son's warm weight felt like losing a limb, but he forced himself to step back, giving Isabella the space she clearly needed. "Of course, do you need anything? We're fine." The words came out sharper than Isabella intended, but she couldn't stop herself from rebuilding walls that had crumbled in those dangerous moments of connection. The posed emphasis hit its mark. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing as Isabella gathered her worn backpack and headed toward the restroom, Miguel fussing against her shoulder. Left alone, Alexander stood frozen, the phantom warmth of his son still lingering in his arms. Other passengers were staring, some with curiosity, others recognizing his face from magazine covers. He was suddenly aware of how he must look, a billionaire standing in economy class, his $1,000 suit incongruous among budget travelers. His phone buzzed insistently. Without thinking, he pulled it out. 17 missed calls from his assistant, 4 from his lawyer, a text marked urgent about the Tokyo merger. The familiar weight of responsibility settled back on his shoulders like a lead blanket. This was his real life, conference calls and hostile takeovers and quarterly projections, not playing house with a woman who clearly despised him and a child who would be better off without the complications his presence would bring. By the time Isabella returned, Alexander had retreated, not physically, but emotionally. The vulnerable man who had held his son with wonder was gone, replaced by the polished CEO who solved problems with calculated precision. "We need to talk," he said, his tone professional, "about arrangements." Isabella's spine straightened at the change in him. There it was, the coldness she remembered, the ability to compartmentalize emotions like filing cabinet drawers. She should have expected it. "Arrangements?" she repeated, settling Miguel on her lap. Her son immediately began reaching for his stuffed lion, crisis, temporarily forgotten. "Financial support, obviously," Alexander continued, pulling out his phone like he was conducting a board meeting. "Education, healthcare, living expenses, I'll have my lawyers draw up something comprehensive. You'll never have to worry about money again." Each word fell between them like stones, building a wall higher than before. Isabella felt her chest tighten with familiar rage, the same rage she'd felt when he'd first offered her money to take care of things. "Is that what you think this is about?" Her voice was deadly quiet. "Money?" Alexander paused in his scrolling, finally looking up. "It's practical, Isabella. The child, Miguel, he's my responsibility now. I need to ensure he's provided for." "The child?" Isabella's laugh was bitter. 5 minutes ago he was our son. Now he's back to being the child? "I'm trying to be complicated." Isabella tested the word like it left a bad taste. "Is that what you call abandoning your pregnant girlfriend, letting your son grow up thinking his father didn't want him?" Miguel looked up at the tension in his mother's voice, little face scrunching with concern. Without thinking, he reached toward Alexander, making the soft sound he used when he wanted to be picked up, and Alexander's hand twitched toward him before he caught himself and pulled back. The rejection was small, instinctive, but Isabella saw it, saw how Alexander's walls slammed back into place the moment real emotional risk presented itself. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, her voice breaking, despite efforts to stay strong. "You can't handle this. You can't handle him." "That's not, isn't it?" Isabella stood, Miguel balanced on her hip, eyes blazing with years of suppressed hurt. The soft tone he used when he wanted to be picked up, Alexander's hand twitched toward him before he caught himself and pulled back. The rejection was small, instinctive, but Isabella saw it, saw how Alexander's walls slammed back into place the moment real emotional risk presented itself. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, her voice breaking, despite efforts to stay strong. "You can't handle this. You can't handle him." "That's not, isn't it?" Isabella stood, Miguel balanced on her hip, eyes blazing with years of suppressed hurt. Alexander's phone chose that moment to ring, the shrill sound cutting through tension like a blade. He glanced at the screen, and Isabella saw his jaw clench. "Tokyo," he said, as if that explained everything. "The merger I've been working on for 6 months. If I don't take this, then take it," Isabella said flatly. "Your real life is calling." The words hung between them like a challenge. Alexander stared at the phone, then at Isabella's face, then at Miguel, who was still reaching for him with the persistent faith of a child who didn't understand rejection. The phone continued to ring. "When faced with choosing between career success and family, what would you do? Is it possible to have both? Or must we always sacrifice one for the other? Let us know your thoughts in the comments." Alexander answered the phone. "Sterling here," he said, voice immediately shifting into the crisp, authoritative tone Isabella remembered. "Yes, I know what time it is in Tokyo. No, the numbers are not acceptable." Isabella felt something die inside her chest as she watched him turn away, literally putting his back to her and Miguel as he conducted business as usual. This was the man she'd fallen in love with. Brilliant, driven, completely incapable of letting anything matter more than the next deal. Miguel whimpered, still reaching for his father, not understanding why the man who had held him so tenderly was now ignoring him completely. Isabella's heart broke for her son, for the confusion in his eyes, for the way his little hand kept stretching toward someone who was already 1,000 miles away despite standing 3 feet from them. "Come on, bébé," she whispered, turning away from Alexander's hunched form. She made it halfway down the aisle before Alexander's voice rose behind her.
"No, I can't fly out tonight. I'm dealing with a family emergency." The words stopped Isabella in her tracks. She turned, despite herself, to see Alexander running a hand through his hair, phone pressed to his ear with white knuckles. "A family emergency?" His assistant's voice was loud enough for Isabella to hear. "Sir, you don't have any family. Are you feeling all right?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Alexander's eyes found Isabella's across the distance between them, and she saw something raw and desperate in his expression, the look of a man standing at a crossroads with no map. "I do now," he said quietly into the phone. "I have a son." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did Isabella. His assistant's shocked silence stretched through the connection while Alexander continued to stare at Isabella with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Sir, what do you need me to do?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to Miguel, who had given up reaching and was now watching his father with that serious expression that seemed far too old for his young face. "Cancel everything," Alexander said suddenly. "Tokyo can wait. The merger can wait. Everything can wait. The board works for me, not the other way around." Alexander cut her off, his voice gaining strength with each word. "And right now, I have something more important to do than make them richer." He hung up without waiting for a response. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella stood frozen in the aisle, Miguel heavy in her arms, as Alexander slowly approached them. But this time, something was different. The corporate mask was gone, replaced by something more uncertain, but infinitely more real. "I'm sorry," he said when he reached them. "You're right. I shut down. I always shut down when things matter too much." "Why?" The question escaped before Isabella could stop it. Alexander was quiet for so long that Isabella thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because everyone I've ever loved has left. My mother died when I was 8. My father taught me that caring too much was weakness, that attachment was a liability. So I learned not to attach." The raw honesty cracked something open in Isabella's chest. She remembered this Alexander, the one who sometimes appeared in unguarded moments, vulnerable and achingly human beneath all that armor. "But Miguel isn't going anywhere," she said softly. "He's your son. That doesn't change, no matter how scared you get." Alexander's eyes filled with something that might have been tears. I don't know how to be what he needs." Miguel chose that moment to speak up, his little voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere with absolute clarity. "Papa sad?" he asked, his little hand reaching out successfully this time, touching Alexander's face with gentle fingers. Alexander closed his eyes at the contact, leaning into his son's touch like a man dying of thirst finally finding water. "Papa is scared, but Papa is here." And despite everything, the years of hurt, the justified anger, the very real fear of being abandoned again, Isabella felt hope take root in her heart like a seed finding sunlight after a long winter. The train continued its journey through the darkness, carrying 3 souls who were just beginning to understand that sometimes the most important destinations aren't marked on any map. The train's sudden lurch threw Isabella against the window, Miguel clutching at her shirt with startled fingers. Alexander instinctively reached out to steady them both, his hand finding Isabella's shoulder just as the lights flickered and died, plunging the car into darkness. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing mechanical difficulties and will need to make an emergency stop. Please remain calm and stay in your seats. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as the train ground to a halt with metallic groans that sounded distinctly unhealthy. Through the windows, Isabella could see nothing but wilderness. Dense forest stretching endlessly in both directions, no signs of civilization anywhere. Miguel whimpered against her chest, frightened by the sudden darkness and unfamiliar sounds. Without thinking, Isabella moved closer to Alexander, seeking comfort from another adult. The irony wasn't lost on her, turning to the very man she'd been trying to keep at arm's length. "It's okay, little one," Alexander said softly, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "Just a little hiccup. The train's just taking a rest." His tone was so naturally soothing that Isabella found herself staring at him in the dim light. This was a side of him she'd never seen, patient, gentle, completely focused on calming a frightened child. "How long do you think we'll be stuck?" she asked, trying to keep anxiety out of her voice. Miguel was sensitive to her moods, and the last thing she needed was to make him more frightened. Alexander pulled out his phone, the screen's glow illuminating his concerned expression. "No signal, but these trains have protocols. They'll have us moving again soon." As if the universe had a sense of humor, the conductor's voice returned with an update that made both adults freeze. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're afraid we're looking at a longer delay than anticipated. We've lost power to the engine and are waiting for a repair crew. Current estimate is 6 to 8 hours before we can continue." 6 to 8 hours. Trapped together in a confined space with emergency lighting and a toddler who was already getting cranky. Isabella felt panic flutter in her chest like a caged bird. 6 hours, she whispered, more to herself than to Alexander. "We'll manage," Alexander said, but she could hear uncertainty beneath his confident tone. "How can I help?" The question was so simple, so free of masculine pride, that Isabella felt her defenses wobble. Miguel gets restless when he's confined, and he'll need dinner soon, and he doesn't nap well in strange places. She was spiraling, listing problems without solutions. 3 years of single motherhood had taught her to handle crises alone, but this felt bigger than she could manage. "Hey," Alexander's hand touched her arm gently. "Breathe. We'll figure it out together." Together. When was the last time someone had offered to share the burden of caring for Miguel? When had anyone said "we" instead of "you"? Miguel chose that moment to announce his displeasure by beginning to fuss in earnest. Isabella tried bouncing him, but the confined space and his growing hunger were a recipe for disaster. "He needs to move around," she said helplessly. "He's been sitting too long." Alexander looked around the cramped car, then at other passengers already shooting irritated glances their way. "The dining car," he said suddenly. "It'll be less crowded, more space to move." "We can't afford—" "It's on me," Alexander said firmly. "Everything's on me. Please, Isabella, let me do this." Pride warred with practical need to keep Miguel happy. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." Alexander's smile was brilliant enough to power the emergency lights. "Come on then, let's go explore." The dining car was indeed less crowded, with only a few passengers nursing drinks and looking resigned to their fate. The server, A kind-faced woman in her 50s took one look at Miguel and immediately brightened. "Well, hello there, handsome," she cooed, and Miguel rewarded her with one of his heart-melting smiles. "What can I get for this little prince?" "Do you have anything child-friendly? He's not very adventurous with food." "Grilled cheese and apple slices works every time." "And for the parents?" The casual assumption that they were a family unit made both adults freeze. Isabella started to correct her, but Alexander spoke first. "Whatever she'd like," he said smoothly. "And coffee, lots of coffee." As they settled into a booth, Miguel immediately claiming the window seat and pressing his nose to the glass, Isabella found herself studying Alexander in the soft lighting. Away from harsh fluorescence, he looked younger, less intimidating, more like the man she had fallen in love with 3 years ago. "You're good with him," she said, watching as Alexander absent-mindedly handed Miguel crayons from a holder on the table. "It's natural." Alexander paused in unwrapping a crayon. "It doesn't feel natural. It feels terrifying." The honesty made Isabella's chest tighten. "Parenting is terrifying, every single day. You just learn to hide it better." "How do you do it?" Alexander asked. "How do you make decisions when someone else's entire life depends on getting it right?" The question was so raw, so vulnerable, that Isabella felt her defenses begin to crack. This wasn't the cold businessman who dismissed her. This was a man genuinely struggling with newfound responsibility. "You make the best choice you can with the information you have, and when you get it wrong, because you will, you apologize and try to do better." Miguel looked up from his earnest scribbling to study Alexander's face with that serious expression Isabella was learning to recognize as genetic. Then, with casual trust that only children possessed, he held out a crayon. "Papa draw?" The word hit Alexander like a physical blow. Isabella watched his face cycle through amazement, terror, and something dangerously close to love. "I'm not very good at drawing," Alexander said softly. "Doesn't matter. Draw with me." And so Alexander Sterling, billionaire CEO, found himself hunched over a paper platimat drawing stick figures with his son while their dinner grew cold. Isabella watched them together, Miguel's dark head bent close to Alexander's, both completely absorbed in their collaboration, and felt something shift irrevocably in her chest. Sometimes the best moments happen when we're forced to slow down and just be present. What unexpected moments have taught you the most about what really matters? Share your stories below. "He's drawing you," Alexander said suddenly, pointing to Miguel's latest creation, a tall stick figure with what might be generously called hair. "That's Papa," Miguel announced proudly. "Papa Tall." Alexander's hand stilled on the crayon. "Miguel, I haven't been a very good papa so far." Miguel looked at him with the directness only children could manage. "Papa here now?" "Yes, Papa is here now." "Good," Miguel said simply, and went back to his drawing as if he had solved all the world's problems with that single word. Isabella felt tears prick at her eyes. Children forgave so easily, loved so completely. If only adults could manage the same grace. "She loves you already," she said quietly. "I can see it." Alexander looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw wonder and terror in equal measure. "I love her too. I didn't know it was possible to love someone so much so quickly." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. If Alexander could love Miguel so completely, so immediately, what did that say about his capacity for other kinds of love? The train gave another mechanical groan, reminding them of their situation. 6 hours stretched ahead, 6 hours of forced proximity, of watching Alexander discover parenthood, of trying to protect her heart from hoping for things that seemed impossible. but as Miguel reached for both their hands, linking them together in his small grip, Isabella wondered if perhaps some impossibilities were worth believing in. The server returned with their food, took one look at their linked hands and Miguel's beaming face, and smiled knowingly. Beautiful family. Some things are just meant to be.
And for the first time in 3 years, Isabella didn't correct the assumption. Instead, she held her son's hand a little tighter and tried not to notice how right it felt when Alexander's fingers intertwined with hers. Outside the windows, the forest stretched endlessly, but inside their small bubble of light, 3 hearts were slowly learning to beat in rhythm together. The forced proximity that had seemed like a curse was beginning to feel suspiciously like a gift. 2 hours into their unexpected captivity, Miguel had fallen asleep, sprawled across the booth seat, his little hand still clutching a green crayon. The dining car had emptied, except for them and an elderly couple playing cards, creating an intimate cocoon that felt both dangerous and necessary. Alexander studied his sleeping son with an intensity that made Isabella's chest ache. She'd seen that same expression on Miguel's face when he encountered something wonderful, the same focused wonder, the same careful attention to detail. "Tell me about him," Alexander said quietly. "Tell me everything. His first word, his first steps. I want to know it all." Isabella wrapped her hands around her cooling coffee cup, using the warmth to steady herself. "His first word was Mama," she began, surprised by how much she wanted to share these memories. He was 8 months old, sitting in his high chair, throwing Cheerios on the floor. I was so tired I was practically falling asleep standing up, and he just looked at me and said it clear as day. Alexander's smile was soft, tinged with regret. I should have been there. "His first steps," Isabella continued, needing to keep talking before her courage failed. "He was 10 months old. I was working a double shift at the diner, and Mrs. Rodriguez from next door was watching him. She called me crying because she was so excited. By the time I got home, he was practically running." Each memory was a small cut, a reminder of moments Alexander had missed, but Isabella found herself wanting to give him these pieces of Miguel's life to help him understand the little boy who had claimed his heart so completely. "He loves music," she said. "Sometimes when he couldn't sleep, I'd put on this old playlist from—" She stopped, realizing what she'd been about to say. "From what?" Alexander prompted gently. Isabella's cheeks flushed. "From when we were together. I kept it, even after—" "The songs you used to play in your apartment?" Miguel would fall asleep to them. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Alexander's eyes darkened with something that looked like pain. "You kept the playlist?" "I kept a lot of things I shouldn't have," Isabella said, her voice barely audible. "I wasn't very good at letting go." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the soft light. "What else did you keep?" Isabella hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo, slightly worn from handling, showing a much younger version of herself laughing at something off-camera. Alexander was visible in the background, watching her with an expression of such tender amazement that it took his breath away. "Maria took this at that company picnic," Isabella said. "You probably don't even remember." "I remember everything about that day," Alexander said, his voice rough. "You wore a yellow dress and kept stealing food off my plate. You laughed so hard at something one of the guys said that you snorted and you were so embarrassed, but I thought it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard." The memory hit Isabella like a physical force. She'd forgotten that he'd been watching her so closely, cataloging her reactions, storing away details that meant nothing to anyone else, but everything to someone falling in love.
Why did you keep it?" Alexander asked. Isabella looked down at Miguel's sleeping form, gathering courage from his peaceful presence. "Because for 4 months, you made me believe in fairy tales. You made me think that someone like me could matter to someone like you." "Someone like you?" Alexander's voice sharpened. "Isabella, you are the most genuine person I've ever met. In a world full of people who wanted something from me, you just wanted me." "Until I wanted too much," Isabella said bitterly. "Until I wanted things you couldn't give." "It wasn't that I couldn't give them," Alexander said quietly. "It was that I was terrified I'd destroy them. I destroy everything I touch, Isabella. It's what I do." The raw pain in his voice made Isabella look up, really look at him. In the soft lighting she could see past the expensive clothes to the man underneath, scarred, lonely, carrying wounds he'd never learned to heal. "Tell me," she said impulsively. "Tell me why you think that." Alexander was quiet for so long that Isabella thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if looking back across decades of buried pain. "My mother died when I was 8. Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, and I used to sit by her hospital bed and promise her I'd be good, that I'd be perfect, if she would just get better." Isabella's heart clenched at the image of a small boy making impossible bargains with fate. "When she died, my father didn't know what to do with a grieving child, so he sent me to boarding school and threw himself into work, built the company into an empire while I learned to be the perfect son from a distance." "Alexander," Isabella whispered, but he continued as if he hadn't heard her. "The few times I came home for holidays, he'd lecture me about legacy, about not letting emotions cloud judgment. He'd tell me stories about business associates who had lost everything because they'd loved unwisely. Love was weakness. Attachment was a liability." Miguel stirred in his sleep, making a small sound that drew both their attention. Alexander's expression softened as he watched his son settle back into peaceful slumber. "When I met you, you terrified me because, for the first time in my life, someone mattered more than the next deal. You made me want things I'd convinced myself I didn't need." Isabella felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Then why?" "Because when you told me I was pregnant, all I could hear was my father's voice telling me I'd let emotions make me weak, that I'd created a complication that would destroy everything I'd built." Alexander's voice cracked. "So, I did what he taught me to do. I eliminated the complication." The words hit Isabella like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at wounds that had never fully healed. But underneath the fresh pain, she heard something else. Not cold calculation, but fear. Bone-deep, paralyzing fear that had made a good man do a terrible thing.
"You eliminated us," she said quietly. "I tried to," Alexander admitted. "But you are already part of me, Isabella. Both of you. Every day for 3 years I've thought about you, wondered where you were, how you were doing. Told myself it was better this way, that you deserved someone who could love you without fear." Isabella stared at him, seeing for the first time the depth of his self-imposed isolation. "You never tried to find us." "I hired a private investigator 6 months after you left," Alexander said quietly. "Called him off before he could report back. I was terrified of what I'd find, that you'd moved on, found someone better, someone who deserved you both. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are fighting battles we never knew about. Have you ever discovered that someone's hurtful actions came from their own pain rather than lack of caring? How did that change your perspective?" "There was never anyone else," Isabella said softly. "How could there be? You were it for me, Alexander. You were my once-in-a-lifetime." Alexander's eyes filled with something that might have been tears. "I was an idiot." "Yes," Isabella agreed, but her voice was gentle rather than accusatory. "But you were a scared idiot. There's a difference." Miguel chose that moment to wake up, blinking owlishly before focusing on his parents with that serious expression. He sat up slowly, hair sticking up at impossible angles, and looked back and forth between them. "Mama, sad?" he asked, his small hand reaching for Isabella's face with the unerring instinct children had for detecting emotion. "A little," Isabella admitted, catching his hand and pressing a kiss to his palm. "But it's okay, Bebe. Sometimes grown-ups need to talk about sad things so they can understand each other better." Miguel considered this with the gravity of a philosopher, then turned to Alexander. "Papa, sad too?" Alexander looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing not just the miracle of his existence, but the 3 years of birthdays and bedtime stories he'd missed through his own cowardice. "Very sad," he said honestly. "Papa made mistakes, big ones." Miguel nodded as if this made perfect sense. Then, with the kind of wisdom that only came from innocence, he reached for both their hands and pulled them together. "No more sad," he declared, with the authority of someone who had solved far more complex problems than adult emotions. "We together now." And in that moment, holding her son's hand while Alexander's fingers intertwined with hers, Isabella felt something she'd thought was dead forever stir to life in her chest. Hope. Dangerous. Terrifying. Absolutely essential hope. The train gave another mechanical groan, reminding them that they were still suspended between destinations, caught between their past and an uncertain future. But for the first time since that devastating day 3 years ago, Isabella began to believe that maybe, just maybe, some stories deserved a second chance at their happily ever after. Outside the windows, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the forest, painting the world in soft pastels that promised new beginnings. And inside their small sanctuary, 3 hearts were learning to trust in the possibility of healing. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the dining car windows when Miguel announced he needed to use the potty. Isabella started to stand, but Alexander was already moving. "May I?" he asked, the question holding more weight than such a simple offer should. "I'd like to, if that's okay." Isabella hesitated only a moment before nodding. He's pretty independent, but he might need help with his pants. Watching Alexander carefully take Miguel's small hand and guide him toward the restroom, Isabella felt something warm unfurl in her chest. There was something achingly tender about the way Alexander matched his stride to Miguel's shorter steps, the way he bent down to listen when Miguel chattered about something important only to him. They returned 10 minutes later, Miguel practically glowing with pride at having successfully navigated his first bathroom trip with Papa. Alexander looked equally proud, as if he'd just closed the most important deal of his career. "He counted to 10 while he washed his hands," Alexander announced, settling back into the booth, "in English and Spanish." "Abuela taught me Spanish," Miguel said seriously, climbing onto Alexander's lap with the casual assumption that this was where he belonged. "Mama's mama. She lives far away, but she calls on the special phone." Isabella's throat tightened. Her mother had never met Miguel in person. Plane tickets to El Salvador were beyond their budget. But she video-called every Sunday, teaching him Spanish words and singing the same lullabies she'd once sung to Isabella. "Tell Papa about Abuela's songs," Isabella encouraged, needing a moment to process the easy way Miguel had claimed his place in Alexander's arms. Miguel immediately launched into an enthusiastic but largely incomprehensible rendition of Los Pollitos Dicen, complete with hand gestures and forgotten verses.
Alexander listened with rapt attention, usually reserved for board presentations, occasionally asking questions that made Miguel giggle and start over. Watching them together, Isabella felt her carefully constructed walls continuing to crumble. This was what she dreamed of during those long nights when Miguel was teething, moments exactly like this. Father and son discovering each other, building the foundation of a relationship that could last a lifetime. "He has your laugh," Alexander said suddenly, looking up at Isabella with an expression so soft it made her breath catch. "You remember how I laugh? I remember everything about you. The way you bite your lip when you're concentrating, how you always order coffee but add so much cream and sugar it's basically dessert, the little sound you make when you're falling asleep." Each memory was a thread connecting them across 3 years of separation, proof that what they'd shared had mattered, had marked him as deeply as it had her. Miguel, oblivious to the emotional undercurrents, had discovered the salt and pepper shakers and was arranging them in complex patterns while humming tunelessly. The simple domesticity of the moment, the three of them sharing breakfast while dawn broke outside, felt more precious than any grand gesture Alexander had once lavished on her. "I used to dream about this," Isabella admitted, the words escaping before she could censor them. "When I was pregnant, scared and alone, I'd imagine scenes like this, you holding him, talking to him, being his father." Alexander's arms tightened around Miguel, who had abandoned the salt and pepper shakers in favor of playing with the buttons on Alexander's shirt. "I dreamed about it too," he said. "I told myself I was better off not knowing, but I dreamed about having a family, about being the kind of father mine never was." The vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache. I could see it so clearly now, the lonely little boy who'd grown into a lonely man, convinced that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. "What kind of father do you want to be?" she asked. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his hand automatically moving to smooth Miguel's hair when our son yawned against his chest. "Present," he said finally. "I want to be present. I want to know his favorite color and what makes him laugh and what he's afraid of. I want him to know that he matters more than any business deal." Miguel had grown heavy against Alexander's chest, the early morning and emotional intensity taking their toll, but instead of restless fidgeting, he seemed completely content to doze in his father's arms. "He trusts you," Isabella observed, watching the peaceful rise and fall of Miguel's breathing. "Or maybe he's just desperate for a father figure," Alexander said, but there was no self-pity in his voice, just honest self-assessment. "No," Isabella said firmly. "Miguel's met other men. My neighbor Carlos watches him sometimes, and he likes him fine. But this is different. This is recognition." As if to prove her point, Miguel stirred slightly and mumbled "Papa" in his sleep, his little fist tangling in Alexander's silk tie. Alexander looked down at his son with such profound love that Isabella had to look away, overwhelmed by the intensity of it. This was what she'd been afraid of. Not that Alexander wouldn't love Miguel, but that he would love him completely, irrevocably, in a way that would make it impossible to protect any of them from future heartbreak. "I bought him a teddy bear once," Alexander said, so quietly Isabella had to strain to hear him, "about 6 months after you left. I was walking past a toy store and saw this brown bear in the window, and I thought about what our child might look like, whether they'd like stuffed animals." Isabella's heart clenched. "What happened to it?" "I threw it away," Alexander admitted. "Told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was no child, no future that included—" He gestured helplessly at Miguel's sleeping form. "I threw away a lot of things I shouldn't have." The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded, and Isabella felt her last defenses completely crumble. This wasn't the cold, calculating man who'd had her escorted from his building. This was someone who'd been in as much pain as she had, who'd made terrible choices from a place of fear rather than indifference. "I kept everything," she confessed. "Every photo, every text message, every ticket stub for movies we saw together. I told myself I'd throw it all away eventually, but I never could." Alexander looked up at her, something like hope flickering in his eyes. "Why?" Because for 4 months, you made me believe in happily ever after, Isabella said simply. And even after everything fell apart, I couldn't quite let go of that belief. The confession hung between them like a bridge, fragile but real. Alexander shifted slightly, careful not to disturb Miguel, and reached across the table to touch Isabella's hand. "I want to try again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve it, I know I have no right to ask, but I want to try to be the man you thought I could be." Isabella looked down at their joined hands, his so much larger than hers, now soft from years of boardroom battles. These hands had held her with such tenderness, had pushed her away with such cruelty, and now held their son like he was made of spun glass. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm terrified that you'll decide this is too hard, too complicated, that you'll retreat back into your safe, predictable world and leave us behind again." "I'm scared too," Alexander said. "I'm terrified that I'll mess this up, that I'll hurt you both through sheer incompetence. But I'm more afraid of living the rest of my life knowing I had a chance at everything I had ever wanted and was too much of a coward to take it." Miguel stirred again, his eyes fluttering open to find both his parents watching him with identical expressions of protective love. He blinked slowly, taking in his surroundings, then smiled with the uncomplicated joy that only children possessed. "Good morning, sunshine," Isabella said softly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Good morning, Mama. Good morning, Papa," Miguel said, and the casual inclusion of Alexander in his morning routine made both adults' eyes fill with tears. Outside the windows the forest was fully illuminated now, golden light filtering through ancient trees and painting everything in warm, hopeful hues. The train gave a hopeful lurch, followed by the sound of mechanical systems coming back to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, "we're pleased to announce that repairs are complete and we'll be resuming our journey shortly." The announcement should have been welcome news, but Isabella felt something like panic flutter in her chest. Once the train started moving again, they'd reach Seattle in a few hours. This unexpected interlude of connection and possibility would become just another memory. But then Alexander's hand tightened around hers, and when she looked up, she saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. "This doesn't end here," he said firmly. "Whatever we decide, whatever happens next, this doesn't end when the train reaches Seattle." Miguel, apparently sensing the gravity of the moment, despite not understanding its implications, reached out to place his small hand on top of their joined ones. "We family now," he announced, with the confidence of someone who had never doubted the power of love to overcome any obstacle. And for the first time in 3 years, Isabella allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. The train lurched into motion, carrying them toward an uncertain future that suddenly held infinite possibilities. The train's resumption should have felt like progress, but as miles clicked away toward Seattle, Isabella found herself growing anxious. Reality was rushing toward them at 70 miles per hour, and with it all the complications they had managed to ignore in their bubble of forced intimacy. Alexander's phone had regained signal an hour ago, and though he'd been trying to ignore it, the constant buzzing was becoming impossible to dismiss. Each notification felt like a reminder of the vast gulf between their worlds. His messages about million-dollar deals, while Isabella worried about whether she had packed enough diapers. Miguel had grown restless as his nap wore off, and the confined space that had felt cozy now seemed cramped. He wanted to explore, to run, to be anywhere but strapped into a seat, and his increasing fussiness was drawing irritated glances from other passengers. "Maybe we should go back to our seats," Isabella suggested, when Miguel's whining reached a particularly grating pitch. "Give you some space to work on those calls you need to return." The words were meant to be considerate, but Alexander heard the distance creeping back into her voice, the way she was already creating space between them as they approached their destination. "I don't need space," he said firmly. "I need to be here, with both of you." But even as he spoke, his phone rang with the tone he'd programmed specifically for emergencies, the sound that meant something was seriously wrong. He glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. James Morrison, his chief counsel. James never called unless there was a crisis that could cost Alexander everything. "I should take this," Alexander said reluctantly, but he could see the disappointment she was trying to hide, the way her walls were already sliding back into place. "Take it," Isabella said, her voice carefully neutral. But Alexander could see the disappointment she was trying to hide, the way her walls were already sliding back into place. He answered the call, stepping slightly away but staying close enough to keep an eye on Miguel, who had begun building a tower with sugar packets. "Alexander? Thank God. We have a problem, a big one. Someone leaked the Tokyo merger details to our biggest competitor. They've made a counteroffer that's going to destroy the deal unless we can match it by tonight. We're talking about a $2 billion loss if this falls through." Alexander felt the familiar weight of crisis settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. $2 billion. Thousands of jobs, years of careful planning hanging by a thread. How is that possible? "We think it came from inside. Someone with high-level access sold us out. The board is in full panic mode. They're demanding an emergency meeting, and they want you here now." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the walls of his old life closing in. "James, I can't. I'm in the middle of a family emergency. Yes, your assistant told me. Alexander, I don't know what's going on, but this is your life's work on the line. If you're not here to handle this personally, the board might vote to replace you as CEO." The words hit Alexander like physical blows. His company, his legacy, everything he'd sacrificed relationships and happiness to build, it could all disappear if he wasn't there to fight for it. "How long do I have?" "The emergency board meeting is in 6 hours. If you can catch the next flight out of Seattle, I'll be there," Alexander said, the words feeling like ashes in his mouth. He hung up and turned to find Isabella watching him with an expression that was rapidly hardening into the protective mask he'd learned to dread. "You have to go," she said. It wasn't a question. "Isabella, You have to go," she repeated, more firmly. Whatever that was about, it sounded important. $1 million important. $2 billion, actually, Alexander said, without thinking, then immediately regretted the admission when he saw Isabella flinch. "Well then," she said, her voice taking on that bright, brittle quality that meant she was breaking apart inside. "That definitely trumps crayon drawings and potty breaks." McGill looked up from his sugar packet construction, sensing the tension with that uncanny ability children had for reading emotional weather patterns. "Papa going?" he asked, his little face already beginning to crumple with confusion and impending loss. The question hit Alexander like a dagger to the chest. He knelt down beside Miguel, trying to find words for something he didn't understand himself. "Papa has to go to work," he said gently. "But I'll be back. I promise I'll be back." "When?" Miguel asked, and the simple question exposed the fundamental problem they were all dancing around. When? When would Alexander be back? When would he have time for weekend visits or bedtime stories or birthday parties? "Soon," Alexander said, hating himself for the lie. "As soon as I can." Isabella stood abruptly, gathering her things with sharp movements. "We should get back to our seats. You'll want to make travel arrangements." "Isabella, please, this isn't what I want." "Isn't it?" She turned to face him, and the pain in her eyes was devastating. "Your real life is calling, Alexander. The life that actually matters to you. We were just a nice distraction while you were stuck on a broken train." "That's not true, and you know it." Do I? Isabella's voice rose just enough to make other passengers glance their way. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like 3 years ago. The second your business needs you, we become an inconvenience to be managed. Miguel started to cry. Not angry wails, but broken sobs of a child who didn't understand why the adults were fighting, but knew it meant something bad was happening. Sometimes we're forced to choose between love and duty, between what our heart wants and what the world demands. How do you balance personal happiness with professional responsibilities? Share your perspective below. Alexander reached for his son, but Isabella was already scooping Miguel up, her maternal instincts overriding everything. Shh, bébé, it's okay. Mama's here. The casual exclusion, "Mama's here," not "we're here," felt like another blade between Alexander's ribs. "I don't have a choice," he said desperately. "If I don't handle this, I could lose everything. Thousands of people depend on those jobs." "And we depend on you," Isabella shot back. "Or we would if you'd let us. But you can't do it, can you? You can't put us first, not even once. That's not fair. This is a crisis." "There will always be a crisis," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "There will always be something more important, more urgent, more valuable than us. That's who you are, Alexander. That's who you've always been." The words hit their mark because they contained enough truth to cut deep. Alexander had built his entire identity around being indispensable, around solving impossible problems and closing impossible deals. But looking at Miguel's tear-streaked face, at Isabella's expression of profound disappointment, he realized that maybe that wasn't who he wanted to be anymore. "If I don't go," he said quietly, "I might lose the company." "And if you do go," Isabella replied, "you'll lose us, again." The choice hung between them like a sword, sharp and unforgiving. Alexander felt the weight of it pressing down, decades of work and sacrifice on one side, the family he had just discovered on the other. His phone buzzed with another urgent message, then another. The crisis was escalating, and every minute he delayed made the situation worse. "I need time to think," he said. "No," Isabella said firmly, settling Miguel more securely in her arms. "What you need is to decide what actually matters to you, and we both already know what that is." She turned away from him, heading back toward their seats, and Alexander felt something fundamental tear inside his chest. He stood frozen in the aisle, watching the woman he loved and the son he had just found walk away from him. His phone rang again. James Morrison. "Alexander, where are you? The board is getting ready to—" "James," Alexander interrupted, his voice strangely calm. "Tell me something. Do you have children?" There's a pause. "Yes, I know you do. 2 daughters." "Alexander, why are you—" "When Sarah was born, were you there?" "Of course I was there. I left the Hensley merger signing to drive to the hospital. Cost us 3 hours of negotiations, but—" James' voice trailed off as understanding dawned. "Alexander, this is different. This is your life's work. Is it? Or is it just work?" He hung up before James could answer and walked slowly back toward economy class. Through the window he could see Isabella's profile, the way she held Miguel protectively, the invisible walls she'd rebuilt around herself and their son. Alexander had always been good at calculating risk and reward, cost and benefit. But standing there watching his family, because that's what they were, he realized, he found himself doing a different kind of calculation. What was a company worth without someone to share the success with? What was wealth without love? What was a legacy built on the bones of every relationship that mattered? Miguel stirred in Isabella's arms, his eyes fluttering open. Even half asleep, he seemed to sense his father's presence, turning toward the glass with that serious expression that was becoming so familiar. "Papa," he whispered, the word barely audible, but hitting Alexander with the force of revelation. That was his legacy, not the buildings with his name on them, not the business empire he'd built from nothing. This child, this beautiful boy who carried his genes and his stubborn chin and his capacity for love, that was what would outlast everything else. Alexander walked back to their seats, his decision crystallizing with each step. Isabella looked up as he approached, her expression carefully neutral, prepared for goodbye. "The car will be here in 90 minutes, she said quietly. "You should make your flight easily." "I'm not getting on the plane," Alexander said. Isabella's carefully composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the hope she'd been trying so hard to suppress. "Alexander, you can't just— Your company will survive without me, or it won't. Either way, I can't be the man I want to be for Miguel if I'm the same man I've always been." Alexander sat down across from them, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place among the budget airline atmosphere of economy class. Miguel immediately reached for him, and this time Alexander didn't hesitate, lifting his son into his arms like he belonged there. "What are you saying?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that 3 years ago I let fear make my decisions for me. I'm saying that I've spent my entire adult life building something that matters less than the 2 people sitting in front of me." Alexander looked down at Miguel, who was playing with his tie with single-minded concentration. "I'm saying that I want to be his father, really be his father, not just on weekends or holidays, but every day." Isabella's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for hours. "You can't just walk away from your life." "I'm not walking away from my life," Alexander said firmly. "I'm walking toward it. For the first time in 30 years, I'm walking toward something that actually matters." Miguel looked up at the sound of his father's voice, his small hand reaching up to touch Alexander's face with gentle fingers. "Papa stay?" he asked, and the simple question contained everything that mattered. "Papa stays," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "If Mama says it's okay, Papa stays." Sometimes the biggest risk is choosing love over security, heart over logic. Have you ever made a choice that seemed foolish to everyone else but felt absolutely right to you? What gave you the courage to follow your heart? Isabella stared at him, through her tears, searching for his face for any sign of the calculation, the cold analysis that had defined their relationship before. But all she saw was a man who looked terrified and determined in equal measure, someone stepping off a cliff because he'd finally found something worth falling for. "Your company," she whispered, "everything you've worked for." "Will be nothing if I lose you again," Alexander said simply. "Isabella, I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I've given you every reason not to trust me. But I'm asking anyway because I love you. I love both of you more than I've ever loved anything in my life." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and utterly without the polished presentation Alexander usually brought to important negotiations. This wasn't a business deal. This was his heart, laid bare and vulnerable, asking for something he had no right to expect. Miguel, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, had fallen back asleep in his father's arms, his breathing steady and peaceful. The sight of them together, her 2 most precious people, made Isabella's decision for her. "We're going to Seattle," she said quietly. "I have a job waiting, a new life planned." "Then I'll come to Seattle," Alexander said immediately. "I'll find a way to run what's left of my company from there, or I'll start something new. I don't care where we live as long as we're together." Isabella laughed through her tears, the sound watery but genuine. "You don't even know what you're saying. You've never lived anywhere but New York. You don't know anything about normal life. about school districts and pediatrician appointments. "Then teach me," Alexander said desperately. "Teach me how to be normal, how to be the man you both deserve." The train was slowing now, the Seattle station coming into view. Soon they'd have to step off into the real world where decisions had consequences and fairy tales were tested against harsh reality. Isabella looked at Alexander, really looked at him, and saw not the polished CEO who'd broken her heart, but the man she'd fallen in love with in quiet moments when his guard was down. That man was still there, underneath all the armor, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready to fight for what mattered instead of running from it. "Okay," she whispered, the single word containing more courage than any she had ever spoken. "Okay?" Alexander's voice cracked with hope. "Okay," Isabella repeated, stronger this time. "But this is it, Alexander. This is your one chance to prove that we matter more than your fear. If you disappear on us again—" "I won't," Alexander said fiercely. "I swear to you, Isabella, I won't disappear again." Miguel stirred at the sound of raised voices, blinking up at them with sleepy confusion. But when he saw both his parents there, both of them crying and smiling at the same time, he seemed to understand that something important had been decided. "We staying together?" he asked, with the directness that only children possessed. "We're staying together," Alexander confirmed, pressing a kiss to his dark hair. "All of us. Forever." The train shuddered to a stop at Seattle's Union Station, the end of one journey and the beginning of something entirely new. Outside the windows, the Pacific Northwest morning was crisp and bright, full of possibilities that hadn't existed when they'd boarded the train in another lifetime. Alexander's phone buzzed one last time. He pulled it out, looked at the screen, another urgent message about the crisis consuming his old life, and then, without hesitation, powered it off. Some calls weren't worth answering. Some crises had to be someone else's problem. Some things were more important and business. And as they gathered their few belongings and prepared to step off the train together, Alexander Sterling finally understood what those things were. The sound of Miguel's laughter echoed through the small Seattle apartment as he chased soap bubbles across the hardwood floor, his bare feet patting against the warm wood while Alexander knelt beside the coffee table blowing bubbles with the serious concentration of a man who discovered that making his son giggle was better than any business deal. "More, Papa, more!" Miguel shrieked with delight, clapping his hands as iridescent spheres danced through the afternoon sunlight. Isabella stood in the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, watching the scene with warmth that still surprised her. 6 months ago, if someone had told her that Alexander Sterling would be sitting on the floor of a modest one-bedroom apartment, wearing jeans and completely absorbed in bubble-making, she would have laughed. But there he was, her reformed billionaire, who'd traded his penthouse for a cozy space near her job at Seattle Children's Hospital, who'd learned to make dinosaur-shaped pancakes and could recite "Goodnight Moon" from memory. "Mama, look!" Miguel called out, pointing at a particularly large bubble floating toward the ceiling. "It's big like Papa." "Very big," Isabella agreed, catching Alexander's eye over their son's head. The look that passed between them was warm, intimate, full of quiet understanding that had grown between them over months of building a life together from scratch. It hadn't been easy. The first month had been a disaster. Alexander's company had collapsed in his absence, taking 2/3 of his fortune with it. The media had a field day with the story of the billionaire CEO who'd walked away from his empire for a woman and child nobody knew existed. There had been lawsuits, video conference calls from their tiny living room, and nights when Alexander stared at the ceiling wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. But then Miguel would crawl into bed between them at dawn, chattering about his dreams, Or Isabella would catch Alexander's hand while they walked to the park, and he'd remember why he'd made the choice he had. Some things were worth more than money. "Papa, story time?" Miguel asked, abandoning the bubbles to climb onto Alexander's lap with the casual ownership of a child who'd never doubted his place in his father's life. "What story do you want to hear?" Alexander asked, settling Miguel against his chest. "The train story," Miguel said immediately. "Tell me about when you and Mama met on the magic train." Isabella and Alexander exchanged a look over Miguel's head. Over the months, their son had become fascinated with the story of how their parents had found each other again on the train to Seattle. In his 2-year-old imagination, it had become a fairy tale, complete with magic and destiny and true love conquering all. He wasn't entirely wrong. "Well," Alexander began, his voice taking on the storytelling cadence he'd perfected. "Once upon a time, there was a very foolish man who had forgotten what was important." As Alexander narrated their story, carefully edited for a toddler audience, Isabella let her mind wander to everything that had changed. Alexander had used what remained of his fortune to start a smaller company focused on sustainable technology. He worked from home most days, took Miguel to the park every afternoon, and had never once answered his phone during family dinner. The transition hadn't been seamless. Alexander still sometimes reverted to CEO mode when stressed, but he was learning, adapting, becoming the man she'd always suspected he could be underneath all that armor. True transformation takes time and patience. What changes have you made in your life that seemed impossible at first, but became your new normal? Share your journey of personal growth in the comments below. "And then what happened?" Miguel prompted when Alexander paused. Then Papa realized that the most important thing in the whole world was right in front of him: his family. "And we all lived happy ever after," Miguel announced with satisfaction. "We certainly did," Isabella said, moving to join them on the couch, settling beside Alexander so that Miguel was surrounded by both parents. Miguel yawned, the excitement catching up with him. Without conscious thought, he arranged himself so that he was touching both parents, one hand on Alexander's chest, his head pillowed on Isabella's shoulder, anchoring himself to both halves of his world. "I love you, Papa. I love you, Mama," Miguel mumbled sleepily. "We love you too, mi amor," Isabella whispered, smoothing his dark hair. Alexander's arm tightened around both of them, his free hand finding Isabella's and intertwining their fingers. 6 months ago, he was the richest man in 3 states and the loneliest person he knew. Now he was definitely not the richest. Their budget required careful attention, but he woke up every morning feeling like he'd won the lottery. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words meant for Isabella. "For what?" "For giving me another chance. For letting me learn how to be a father. For showing me what home actually feels like." Isabella lifted their joined hands to press a kiss to his knuckles. "Thank you for choosing us. For choosing love." They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light shifted to golden hour, painting their small living room in warm hues that made everything look touched by magic. Miguel's breathing had evened out into deep sleep, but neither parent made any move to transfer him to his bed. These moments, the 3 of them together, peaceful and complete, were too precious to cut short. Alexander's phone, charging in the kitchen, buzzed with what was probably another interview request from a business magazine wanting to know why he'd walked away from billions. He'd stopped taking those calls weeks ago. The story wasn't complicated enough for a magazine feature. A man had found his family and chosen them over everything else. The end. "Do you ever regret it?" Isabella asked quietly, reading his thoughts. "Walking away from everything you'd built?" Alexander considered the question seriously, looking around their modest home. The walls were decorated with Miguel's artwork and family photos. The furniture was comfortable rather than expensive. The view from their window showed the parking lot of a grocery store instead of a city skyline. "I regret how long it took me to figure out what mattered," he said finally, "but I don't regret anything that brought me here, to this moment with both of you." Isabella smiled, the expression transforming her face with radiant happiness. "Even when Miguel put peanut butter in your laptop keyboard?" "Even then," Alexander laughed, remembering last week's incident. "Though, maybe we should hide the peanut butter better." "Noted," Isabella said solemnly, then dissolved into quiet giggles that made Alexander's heart skip beats. Outside their window, Seattle was settling into evening, commuters heading home, couples meeting for dinner dates, families gathering around tables. The city hummed with the lives of people pursuing their own versions of happiness, their own definitions of success. Inside their small apartment, 3 people who'd found each other against impossible odds were living proof that sometimes the best stories are the ones that seem too good to be true. Miguel stirred in his sleep, unconsciously pressing closer to his parents' warmth. His little face was peaceful, unmarked by worry, secure in the knowledge that both his parents were there, and would be there when he woke up. "He's going to be okay," Isabella whispered, watching their son sleep. "He's going to grow up knowing what love looks like." "We are too," Alexander replied, his voice soft with wonder. "We're all going to be okay." As the sun set over Seattle, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the Sterling family, for that's what they were now, officially and irrevocably, settled deeper into their couch, into their contentment, into their once upon a time that had become their happily ever after. Because sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, love really does conquer all. The train that had brought them together was probably halfway across the country by now, carrying other passengers toward their own destinies. But its most important work was done. It had delivered 3 souls to exactly where they belonged. Together. Forever. Home. What moment in your life felt like everything changed forever? Sometimes our greatest transformations happen in the most unexpected places, like a broken-down train in the middle of nowhere. Share your own life-changing moment in the comments below, and let us know, do you believe in second chances? Thank you for joining this journey of discovery, redemption, and the bridges we build to connect across the divides that separate us. Share your thoughts about second chances and the hidden gifts of the people around us. We'd love to hear your stories of unexpected connections that changed everything. Please like, subscribe, and share, because every story of choosing love over fear matters.